Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Garden City Library. My name is Brian Panola. I'm on the board at the Garden City Historical Society. And this evening, in conjunction with our village historian, Bill Bellmer, wave Bill, we are presenting tonight's lecture. Before we begin the lecture, I want to point out a few people. We are joined by the president of the Garden City Historical Society, Mary Mahoney, right there. Her able vice president, Beth Watchers, right next to her. We have a couple other trustees too. We have Terry Kenny over there, Mary Jane Caldwell, and Gloria Jones. We also have another special guest with us this evening from a county-wide organization, and that is Dr. Natalie Naylor from the Nassau County Historical Society right here. I also want to just do a quick public service announcement to mention, for any of you that are not aware, our museum, the Historical Society Museum, which is located over on 11th Street, we're undergoing a huge capital campaign to restore the museum, the exterior of the museum. This has been going on for quite a while. We have professional architects and a professional contractor working with us. And we have a wonderful gala coming up a week from this Friday, right across the street at the Garden City Hotel. So if you're interested, you can find the information on the internet, or you can talk to any of the board members. We'd love you to join us. It's going to be a wonderful event. We have live music, and of course it's a fundraiser to help us restore the museum. With that said, tonight's program is going to talk about a part of Garden City's history that you don't normally hear about.
Don't forget, we have a small contingent from the West Hempstead Historical Society. You gotta mention us. You gotta mention us. We don't have as much history as Garden City, but
you probably have just as much if you're
the Hempstead Plains. The Hempstead Plains.
It should have been the West Hempstead Plains, right?
Right, back in the 1600s, right?
But we love Garden City.
Thank you. And we like West Hempstead too.
We love Trimming Square.
Oh, you see?
Oh, Frank,
Digging
right,
in there.
right.
Trimming Square.
Well, as I was saying though, you don't normally hear about the information that you're going to learn about this evening, because this is what took place before A.T. Stewart purchased the Hempstead Plains in 1869, and the things that occurred around that time and shortly thereafter. And our speaker this evening, who's a longtime resident here in Garden City, Jamie Falls, spent 7 or 8 years compiling research on this subject, and he has quite a bit of information that he's going to share with us this evening. So everyone, let's give Jamie a big Garden City welcome.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. I want to thank the Garden City Historical Society for inviting me here today. On the 13th of September, this weekend, the communities of Garden City, Stewart Manor, West Hempstead, and a number of communities to the east will be commemorating the 150th anniversary of the conveyance of a deed from the town of Hempstead to Alexander T. Stewart. That deed conveyed approximately 7,170 acres, more or less. Today I plan to talk about the conveyance of that deed in September 1869. We'll consider a series of events that took place in the preceding months that led to the town of Hempstead selling the Hempstead Plains to Stewart. There were people living and farming on the Hempstead Plains in 1869 and prior to then. We'll go into Stewart's efforts in the 2 years after the purchase to clear over 30 farms from the western part of the Hempstead Plains, essentially farms that are in what is today Garden City. And we'll spice it up by talking for a few minutes about a political scandal 14 years before Stewart's purchase that, in my view, set the wheels in motion for Hempstead to sell their plains. I've been looking for a map for 8 years. It's a map of Stewart's purchase. there should be a town copy, and there should be a Stewart copy, and any number of copies that went to lawyers, a bishop, county clerks, judges, and the men who were competing with Stewart to purchase the Hempstead Plains. To this day, I have not found a copy. But I'm a resourceful guy, and I managed to find detailed maps from 1869, 1870, and 1873, prepared by Stewart's own surveyor. Together, these maps comprehend more than 95% of Stewart's purchase. 1 year ago, I walked up to the reference desk at this very library and I asked if anyone here might be able to talk to me about where this map might be. I met your village historian, Bill Belmer. We both understood the historical importance of the reconstruction that the maps that I have allow. And tonight we'll show you the detail of those maps and we'll talk a bit about them. Before we get started, I want to level the playing field. Not everybody's a scholar on Alexander Stewart or Garden City. So let's talk first about the town of Hempstead, particularly its partition from the town of North Hempstead. And we'll also talk about the plains themselves, and we'll talk about Alexander Stewart. We're going to discuss Long Island's history. I want everyone who may not be aware to be aware that Nassau County used to be part of Queens County. And I've got to keep this thing rolling here.
Can we cut the lights?
There you go. So Nassau County used to be part of Queens County. Modern-day Nassau County comprised a much larger part of Queens County than the fragments that are left behind. Here's modern Nassau County, here's modern Queens County with the Rockaways. The Rockaways were stolen from the town of Hempstead when New York City consolidated into the 5 boroughs in 1898. Nassau County was created January 1st, 1899, 1 year after the consolidation of New York City. The 3 towns that remain part of Queens County are Jamaica Town, which is of course obsolete, Flushing Town, and Newtown. If you're a Met fan, you might think that the Mets play baseball in Flushing, but absolutely not. They've never played a game in the old town of Flushing. They play in Newtown on the west side of Flushing Creek. Be aware that the 2 modern towns of Hempstead and North Hempstead were once a single town called Hempstead, right there. The original town of Hempstead existed from 1644 to 1784. Old Hempstead Town, the combined town that was partitioned, gave its name to Hempstead Harbor and to the Hempstead Plains. I don't know the precise cause of the rift between the South Hempstead people and the North Hempstead people. It could be that the North Shore people had some grievances against their cousins across the plains. I'm really not sure. I do know of some marriages taking place between British officers during the Revolutionary War and young ladies from Hempstead. And with Hempstead Village well garrisoned, it stands to reason that some Hempstead merchants did very well for themselves trading with the enemy for 7 years during the occupation, 1776 to 1784. Still, I wonder if the rift between the 2 towns was due more to rage than to reason. When the 2 towns were partitioned, South Hempstead got more than 7,000 acres of unfenced Hempstead Plains. North Hempstead got about 1,000 acres of unfenced, open Hempstead Plains. Only 1,000 acres in North Hempstead because it's a smaller place, and the north side of the Hempstead Plains had been devoted to farming for dozens and scores of years before 1784, whereas the open plains of what became the town of Hempstead had long been the pasture, the common land pasture of the overall town of Hempstead, the pre-partition town of Hempstead. Let's just advance. Here we go. To sum it all up, you are now aware that the story takes place in the town of Hempstead, Queens County, and that the original town of Hempstead existed in colonial times and was succeeded after the Revolution by the modern towns of Hempstead and North Hempstead. Welcome, I'm James Falls. I live a bit over 2 miles away from here, northwest. I don't actually live in the village of Garden City. If you know where Nassau Boulevard comes to its glorious end at Marcus Avenue in the town of North Hempstead, then you know where I live. I don't consider myself a historian, and I'm certainly not an historian. The Hempstead Plains don't receive much attention from real historians. Real historians write books about New York City, Brooklyn, the Hudson River. The Hempstead Plains don't get much attention. Tonight you're stuck with me, an inquisitive amateur. Before we begin talking about people and events, let's mention the Hempstead Plains. We're on Long Island in the state of New York. We're less than 20 miles east of New York City Hall. We're less than 100 feet above sea level. Before your feet lie hundreds of feet in sand and gravel brought here by a glacier and by erosion, and below that hundreds more feet of ocean sediment. About 800 feet down, you hit bedrock. Right about there would be that. So we're sitting on a big pile of sand here. Forget for a moment that we're 1 story underground. We are in the midst of a natural land feature called the Great Plains of Long Island. The main part of the Great Plains sprawls across the sister towns of Hempstead and North Hempstead and has been called the Hempstead Plains for over 350 years. When the Europeans arrived in the early 1600s, they found the plains a great prairie, a great grassland. In 1670, Daniel Denton recorded the Great Plains as being 16 miles long and 4 miles broad, upwards of 40,000 acres. Nowadays, the plains are devoted to suburban housing, commerce, recreation, with schools and hospitals, places for cops and places for robbers. To the north of the plains lies a ridge of hills, speckled with ponds. Let's see if I can get back to that. There you go. You have all these ponds on the ridge of hills that lie just to the north of the plains. In fact, some of the best views of Hempstead Plains are found from those hills. For instance, the Grand Central Parkway, as it courses through eastern Queens, you would get a marvelous view of the Hempstead Plains. To the south of the plains, streams appear and flow to our South Shore bays. Before the Civil War, the city of Brooklyn tapped many of those streams and mill ponds for public drinking water. 75 years later, when there was no more city of Brooklyn and those lands were owned by the city of New York, 75 years later, in the early 20th century, Robert Moses took those old properties off the hands of New York City and built New York City, Nassau County's stream beds into state parks and parkways. The Great Plains extend easterly into Oyster Bay Town around Hicksville and Bethpage, and a little bit into Old Queens County towns of Flushing and Jamaica. The Hempstead Plains gained their fame in the 1660s after Old Hempstead Town came under English control. Charles II, here's his picture. Charles II was the King of England at this time, and His Majesty especially enjoyed horse racing. That was all the reason the well-born Englishmen in New York needed to organize horse races on Hempstead Plains. It's gospel around here that the races on Hempstead Plains in 1665 were the first horse races organized in English North America. No one alive can prove or disprove that, but there's no doubt that horse racing cemented the fame of the Hempstead Plains. The plains were also famous for being, in the eyes of many, a wasteland, Consider this. When he took his famous 1790 tour of Long Island on horseback, President George Washington arrived at Hempstead around midday after setting out from Jamaica. He stopped only long enough to feed and water the horses and his men, and then he made a right turn and headed straight for Merrick. On the way back from Coram and Huntington, he never came near the plains. So the plains are a bit of an unloved land. It has been my experience that many of the maps from the early 1800s do a pretty bad job of depicting the Hempstead Plains. I realized that deeds, not maps, might give a more precise picture of the lay of the land. My study of the plains has mainly been a study of deeds. That search for deeds has also led me to several maps. There are a couple of maps that came out before the Civil War that are actually pretty accurate in depicting the Hempstead Plains. This is an 1802 map by the Surveyor General of the state of New York, Simeon DeWitt, and it fairly accurately shows where the plains were. One thing I like to point out is there's this little bit of the plains up here that runs up what is Woodbury Road. If you go up to Woodbury Road today, you'll see that it's a perfectly, almost level road with a very slight incline, which must have been quite a nice thing for the horses that were charged with pulling wagons up there. That road heading out of Hicksville to Woodbury was the post road to Huntington. And on this map you can also see Jericho Turnpike goes no further than Jericho. Compare the 1802 map with the earlier map I showed of the Hempstead of Stewart's Purchase. Let me see if I can find that. I should have inserted it. There you go. This was in Harper's Weekly magazine in 1869. This is the only map that I have found that is a map of Stewart's Purchase. And when you see the original map, it's on a piece of paper, it's about that big. So it's not very detailed at all. Yet it does give a fairly good representation of what Stewart purchased. Let me fly through back to where we were. An excellent map was surveyed for the United States government by T.A. Jenkins in 1837. It shows roads radiating out from the village of Hempstead. It also shows roads going from Herrick's Road down to Woodmere, East Rockaway. Shows your roads going to New York City. It shows this road here, which is still partly in existence. This is Atlantic Avenue, coming out of the village of Hempstead, heading up toward what was to become the new Hyde Park Station area. But the original road was a road from Hempstead to Lake Success, to the village up there called Success. The 1837 map very clearly shows part of the old dividing road with North Hempstead. Unfortunately, I seem to have chopped that off, but we'll get back to that later. And then in 1859, a very good map, really a map that is in a class by itself, was published by a surveyor named Walling. This shows certain things like the Washington Race Course. It shows that there were people living on the plains here. Here's the Hempstead Branch Railroad going up to what did become Mineola. That had to be right after Mineola changed its name from Hempstead Branch, 1859. And it also shows this road going from Hempstead Village up toward New Hyde Park. This road, of course, was obliterated when the Hempstead Purchase took place and Stewart put his own grid onto the area. I can't even begin to guess how many wonderful old maps of old Hempstead town went back to England with the English when the American Revolution ended. As for modern maps, this map, which I believe was produced by satellite data, is on the website of a Hofstra professor named Bennington. I would urge all of you, if you're interested in what's around here, this is a really, really fine map that shows just how flat and featureless the Hempstead Plains, and it also shows that Woodbury Road area, flat and featureless the Hempstead Plains were. These are basically sumps. These little things here, these are modern holes in the ground to keep the rainwater away. But I'm a big fan of that map by J. Brett Bennington of Hofstra's. He's a professor of geology at Hofstra. Stewart's purchase amounted to 7,170 acres. That's a far cry from the upwards of 40,000 acres suggested by Daniel Denton 200 years earlier. Instead of being 16 miles long and 4 miles broad, Stewart's purchase is only about 10 miles long, and in some places, notably in Garden City, barely 1 or 1.5 miles broad. A few words about the Stewarts. Alexander Turney Stewart and Cornelia Clinch Stewart left no surviving children. Alexander T. Stewart was one of the richest people who ever lived. He opened his first store in Manhattan in 1823, and he died in 1876, 7 years after he purchased the common plains of the town of Hempstead. He is the founder of Garden City. His widow, Cornelia, built the Cathedral of the Incarnation in his memory. They lie entombed here in Garden City. And I know there's an asterisk next to that, but they do. When Stewart opened that first store in 1823, the town of Hempstead's plains remained open and unfenced, as they had been since they formed after the last ice age. In 1825, the Erie Canal was opened, and within the space of a few years, Brooklyn was transformed from a sleepy village and an even sleepier township into one of America's great cities. By the end of the 1830s, the part of the Hempstead Plains that was to become Garden City saw railroad tracks laid across the main line and along the branch railroad from Mineola to Hempstead. In colonial times, Long Island farmers were self-sufficient. They grew their own timber, usually on woodlots a short distance away from their own farms. They raised their own pigs and cattle for meat and leather. They made their own beer, grew their own tobacco, their own wheat and corn, their own flax for linen. They set loose their sheep to graze the summer away on the Hempstead Plains, and they dressed in clothing made from homemade wool. Railroads and other applications of steam power changed that. By the mid-1800s, mass-produced cotton goods were coming in from England and New England. The forests of Maine, upstate New York, and Pennsylvania were opened up to large-scale logging. Coal was replacing wood in the hearth. Long Island farmers gave up wheat and wool growing in favor of producing milk, poultry, eggs, butter, and cheese for the nearby metropolis. My guess is that by 1850, the women of Hempstead were better acquainted with shopping at A.T. Stewart and Company's Marble Palace at 280 Broadway than they were with their own grandmother's loom. Once the beating heart of the town of Hempstead, by the middle of the 1800s, the plains were now a question in search of an answer. What was to be done with them? My fellow students, today our talk is entitled 1869, Garden City on the Eve of Stewart's Purchase. It's evident that many of you are energized and inspired and derive pride of place from the story of the Stewarts and the successful development of Garden City. If you're in that group, then Stewart's purchase of the Hempstead Plains on September 13, 1869 marks a beginning for me and my study of the Hempstead Plains as they existed before suburbia. Stewart's purchase is an event heralding the end of my study. I've run quite long in making my opening remarks, so now let me reward you for your patience. It's my pleasure to show you a set of Stewart's own maps of Garden City. These aren't maps from the 1870s that have some sort of fanciful, let's see if I can find that. Nope, I can't. That have some sort of fanciful street grid that never actually existed. These are maps that were filed with deeds that Stewart took to the Queens County Courthouse, and they document the purchases that he made in 1869 and 1870 when he was clearing 30 or so properties off the Hempstead Plains. Let's look at a few views of Garden City in 1869 right now. This is one of Stewart's maps. I don't know how many of you can figure out where we are, but the boundary of Garden City today runs along this line, and then the recreation center's down here. This is Cherry Valley Avenue. This is basically Cherry Valley itself, the landform. This is Atlantic Avenue coming up from Hempstead. This is John Street, which is a forerunner to Nassau Boulevard. It was slightly moved to the east when Garden City Estates was developed in 1906 and thereafter. And here's that street that runs up to New Hyde Park, Washington Avenue. We have all these lots. Stewart had to buy all of these out, but it's just interesting that there was a cluster of farms that went up, and look at this little narrow opening between the Maryland Avenue station area and this solid block of farms. So when we imagine the Hempstead Plains as an open, unfenced prairie where horses could just run forever, you've got to figure out that by 1869 they only had a very narrow area up here to roam free. The plains had absolutely changed from our early conception from Daniel Denton 200 years earlier. At the North Hempstead line, John Street heads northward from a point a little bit west of the underpass at Maryland Avenue, Nassau Boulevard Station. And it runs up this road on a direct course to the Queens County Courthouse and beyond that to Herrick's. The courthouse stood from 1790s to around 1910. And a cluster of properties appears in Cherry Valley. There's some properties over here by, is this Cathedral Avenue down here by Atlantica? No, Cathedral Avenue is over here. This is what, Hilton Avenue over here, roughly? I'm not exactly sure. But this gigantic cluster of farms over in the John Street area. This is 57 acres, 81 acres. These are very, very big properties, 50 some odd acres here. The area around the Nassau Boulevard train station was pretty thickly settled at the time that Stewart came along. In this southwest area over here, see, that's Courthouse Road coming up from Franklin Square. And it continued up to this point. It doesn't actually show on this map. There are other maps that do show a continuous road. But this goes through the property of the golf course, the Garden City Country Club, and then turns uphill and heads up to the Maryland Avenue area. Stewart bought all these Cherry Valley parcels. He bought all the parcels that are now in Garden City Estates. Despite what some crazy maps might show, the Newmarket Racecourse, which we really don't know exactly where it was, but the Newmarket Racecourse would likely have been somewhere on this map. The configuration, I believe that the configuration of the racecourse changed over time. I don't think there was just one place called Newmarket. I think the races, you know, we're not upset that Yankee Stadium is across the street from where it was 15 years ago. We're not upset that Madison Square Garden is a mile away from where it was 55 years ago. So I think it's very reasonable to think that in the 1660s, the Newmarket races may have been run closer to New Hyde Park or further from New Hyde Park or closer to Hempstead, and then moved about over time as racing changed. My idea is that the early races in the 1600s were not around an oval track. I think they would have been cross-country races, horse on horse, jockey on jockey. And as time passed, by the 1820s, and Newmarket was running at the Washington Racecourse, then I can see that they would have had a grandstand and they would have had an oval and all that. But I think over 150 years, you can't expect everything to change. But I do believe that the Newmarket races, this is the most likely area for where those races will run. Wouldn't it be great if we could somehow find a tavern site along John Street that served the clientele on race days? One more thing about this 1870 map. Many of you know where the current boundary between North Hempstead and Hempstead is. I have 5 maps that basically show it as it was redrawn. The boundary between Hempstead and North Hempstead was redrawn in 1871. This map is in the Nassau County Office Building. Here is the boundary running along the middle of Jericho Turnpike in front of Obadiah Bergen's, Oldfield Bergen's house. It deviates and it runs on a straight line. It runs into New Hyde Park. This would be Lakeville Road. This is a road, this is actually Miller's Lane in New Hyde Park that runs to the New Hyde Park train station. And you punch them in and they continue toward Mineola. The current modern township boundary runs through New Hyde Park in the train station area and crosses, that would be Tanner's Pond Road, Denton Avenue there. And the modern township boundary crosses right about at the Maryland Avenue, crosses the tracks right about at the Maryland Avenue train station, which would be right around there. This is Herrick's Road, and this is the Hempstead Branch. The modern township boundary actually starts in the center line of Old Country Road and in the center line of the Hempstead Branch Railroad, as we can see on this map. So there was a clear landmark to where they began the redrawing of the township boundary. The point at which Old Country Road, which is what I call this missing stretch of the dividing road, it's Old Country Road. It crossed Denton Avenue, Tanner's Pond Road, a few hundred feet north of the current Stone Bridge overpass on Tanner's Pond Road. And that boundary is marked even today by a slight bend in the road. The township boundary is also marked on Jericho Turnpike by a bend in the road. And that's about where Applebee's restaurant, if you remember Castro Convertibles or the Dublin Pub, in that area of Jericho Turnpike, there's a bend in the road. That's where the dividing road once came in. With information and measurements taken from deeds and old town records, I have plotted the old dividing line between Hempstead and North Hempstead, the original 1784 dividing line, which has been replaced by that straight line from Mineola to Oldfield Bergen's house in Floral Park. But before putting it up on the screen, I want you people to be aware that I have shown this map to fewer than 20 people. You are a very select group. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to present the missing stretch of Old Country Road. This is the town dividing line as it stood in 1784. You come off of, there's the high school there, there's Old Country Road, its termination there. It continued along this property line between these two sumps. It continued to a point here, and then over by the Maryland Avenue station, finally crossing over and heading up. These are based on actual deed and survey references. This isn't fiction. This is where the road actually used to be. And what I love about it is that you actually get a nice fork in the road, where today there's just this little bend in Jericho Turnpike. There was an actual fork in the road, and that suggests that there was something there. What was there was a tavern, of course. It was Peter's Inn, and it was beside Windmill Pond, which was a pond that I believe was here, but of course, I haven't dug holes in the ground and pulled out pond sediment, so someone else is going to have to prove my theory. But that is the missing stretch of Old Country Road. Let's get back to the Stewart map for just a second. Oops. At John Street, by the train tracks, you see 3 lots. Right up here right there. 1, 2, 3. 2 of those were in the town of North Hempstead. Now they are, of course, in the town of Hempstead since they redrew the line. All of them were owned by a farmer named Willett Lawrence. The tiny one, the 1-acre property there, that has been and still is in the town of Hempstead. The 2 larger lots adjacent to the train tracks were in North Hempstead and were not part of the 1869 Hempstead Plains purchase. A 4th lot over here, east of Herrick's Road, also in North Hempstead. Oh no, I'm sorry, the fourth lot was over here. This was left off the map. The man who made a claim to a very small piece over here, Stewart paid him $25 just to go away.
Yeah, a lot of money back then.
Yeah, gold. Stewart bought all these 4 lots over here. The 4th one's not even shown on the map. Stewart also bought the lot in North Hempstead on the east side of Herrick's Road, and is shown on this map framed by Old Country Road, the Long Island Railroad, and Herrick's Road. He never bought the lot in North Hempstead on the west side of Herrick's Road. That lot is notable in Long Island Railroad history as the site of the Closeville station. It was one of the Long Island Railroad's original mainline stations from March 1st, 1837. Today, that lot maintains its 1837 shape and is the larger of 2 stormwater recharge basins, or sumps, lying to the north of Garden City High School. And because of the realignment in 1871 of the township boundary, that sump is today only partly in North Hempstead. The second map from 1869 that I'd like to show you is a map showing the boundary between the village of Garden City and the village of Hempstead. It's marked on this map as the baseline. Right in there you see baseline. These are all properties. These are all properties in Garden City, really from here up. This is all Garden City. This is the village of Hempstead, even to this day. Before Stewart's purchase, the area to the north of the baseline was almost certainly the site of a Revolutionary War era British encampment, where hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers spent their winters, and where I suspect vast amounts of archaeology could be discovered. But something tells me that the folks along Meadow Street wouldn't be too keen to seeing trenches put in their front and backyards.
Picking up their lawn. Yeah.
It would seem that the village of Hempstead, which barely went 2 blocks north of Fulton Street in the 1830s, had expanded northward with time. Why the town of Hempstead stripped the lands north of the base